just logging on and making sure it's fine.
No idea.
Picking up sound here.
It says little style
I'll
at
spend
8:30,
6 minutes going off of there.
which it's 8:32 apparently.
8:30.
Yeah, so it's supposed to start 2 minutes ago apparently.
Do you mean 6:30? 18:30?
Sorry, 6:30.
It says that it started. It's live for the last 30 seconds. 3 seconds.
No, it's not.
You kind of
It's just reverted to 7 seconds.
run with
I'm quite up there.
and then try and correct me.
Working or no?
I mean, I would never be brave enough to like.
There we go.
It's working. Okay. We're gonna start.
You said it's 1,000 pages.
Okay, welcome everyone to the final seminar in the Žižek course presented by Dr. Chris Boredom for the Queensland School of Continental Philosophy. Thanks for coming for this session and for coming for the previous sessions. As always, we'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Yagara and Turrbal people, acknowledge that learning has gone on here for time immemorial. And I will throw it over to Dr. Chris Boredom for the final Žižek seminar.
Okay, so a couple of things about this last part of the course. So I'm hoping to take us to, I guess, some sort of culmination of what I think Žižek's philosophy is all about. We are going to be talking about the meaning of life, and we're going to be reading and thinking about some of the weirdest and most obscure, what I think are the most poetic and the weirdest and the most obscure parts of Žižek's philosophy. So everything we've done so far has led us up to be able to understand what he's talking about when he begins to use words like the absolute and the divine, and says things like, if you want to be a true atheist, then you should be a Christian. These seemingly paradoxical statements. So that's what I'm hoping to make sense of. What have we done so far? Okay, there we go. This is what we've done so far. We started by looking at his, and of course, my point here is that once you understand Žižek's ontology, I think everything follows from that. And so one of the arguments of the whole course has been that Žižek is actually quite a systematic thinker. That once you understand what his ontology is, all the other parts of his philosophy actually flow from that. Whereas he can give the impression he's just making fairly random statements and analyses of films that he likes, and he's looking at something going, oh, well, Khan would say this. There's actually something really, really carefully constructed happening behind the scenes that's guiding his thinking. So we start with the idea of his dialectical materialism. That is that reality is not all, and that it's the subject, or this phenomenon of subjectivity that makes substance incomplete. One of the key things of that then is that there is no necessary order. There is no big other. There's nothing that you can appeal to say that, well, this is the way things have to be. There's no, even necessity is contingent in the sense that you might have something like, say, a law of gravity, but the fact that the law of gravity is contingent. There's no other out there that's grounding that. We've also looked at this idea of the death drive, and the death drive is really important for him because the death drive marks this idea of the point where nature stops being nature, or nature becomes inconsistent with itself. In a way, it's the way in which his dialectical materialism manifests in the actions that someone takes. So the death drive is this idea of an insistent, mindless repetition that persists for its own sake, that's indifferent to anything symbolic or ontic. And when I use those terms, you can just sort of replace them with anything cultural in terms of cultural rules, cultural language, or anything in reality in terms of the natural order itself, anything in the world. The death drive is something that breaks free from both those things and just persists for its own sake. We've also looked at how that links to his idea of politics. And in particular, his idea of politics is that you can believe that you should affirm a concrete universal. And the concrete universal is just that there's one thing that every single person has in common and that you can use to ground a genuinely universal emancipatory politics, and that is that everyone is not their identity. That any form of social or cultural identity falls short, that it's always constitutively incomplete. And in that essential alienation that's a part of identity, you can actually find the thing that makes sure that everyone counts as one, and which in a left-wing sense means you identify with that subject in a particular situation who's been excluded, who actually is created as a subject, that excluded subject. And we've also looked at how all those things underpin both his ideas of freedom and his idea of ethics, both of which involve this idea of you follow through on your necessity. And so that's what we've done so far. And we've also learned, this is Žižek's motto for the, I'm going to go back to that. So I want to make a comment about the meaning of life now. You're going to have to bear with me here, because on the surface, I know the question of the meaning of life is such a naive and, a seemingly stupid question. But I think it's worth just sitting back and thinking why. So on the surface, if we're going to approach Žižek's philosophy and say, well, does Žižek's philosophy say that life is meaningful or meaningless? On the surface, the answer is, well, it's meaningless because there is no big other. There's no transcendent order. And normally when we think of life having purpose, what we mean is, something created me and gave me a purpose. That my purpose is determined by some big other that's other than myself. So the typical reasoning around why in the West today we've lost the idea that life is meaningful is like, it's because we've become mostly a secular and atheist society. We've lost this idea of God giving us purpose. Therefore, life is meaningless, it's nihilistic and so on. But the problem with that conception of life, the purpose of life having to be grounded in a big other, is that when at the moment you actually bring a subject into it, it just doesn't work. So let's imagine, for instance, and I know I've said this, I think, back in the first lecture, but let's just suppose that we did suddenly meet God, and God came down and said, "Hello, it's me. Yes, I created you, and I'm here to tell you there is a purpose in life. I did give you a purpose, and here it is." It doesn't get rid of the problem, because in that instance, because you're a subject, you still have the ability to either say, "Oh yeah, I accept that," or defy it and say, "No, I don't accept that. I actually don't want to live according to that purpose." The very fact that even if we imagine there being a purpose, that doesn't guarantee our purpose, that in a way is a really clear manifestation of what we mean by that phenomenon of subjectivity. It's just this gap that means that what isn't what has to be. So it's just not the case that if you get rid of and this is the thing, the common sense view is that if you get rid of a big other, then yes, of course, everything's purposeless, it's meaningless, there's no purpose to anything. It's like, that's a really strange definition of purpose when you think about it. Why do we think of purpose being something that's grounded by, that has to be grounded by a big other? And the gamble of Žižek is basically this, that when you actually do seriously get rid of the big other, it's not that you retreat into some sort of cynical dismissal of the meaningfulness or the purposiveness of things. It's actually the opposite. When you follow that through to its logical extension, what you arrive at is a position of love. That what it means is you have to choose your commitments, but that's not quite right either. What it rather means is that the lack of a big other means that when we find our purpose, it's a purpose that is absolute to us and that isn't guaranteed by anything other than the fact that we've chosen it, right? So I will give you a concrete example, but I mean, you can, and this is actually a fairly mundane example, because one of the things that's always interested me and surprised me about the question of meaning of life is that although a lot of people who do philosophy or a lot of people who are, say, interested in philosophy will go around saying, yes, people act as if life is meaningful, but if you look at it philosophically, actually it's largely meaningless. Like, we can take down the veils of the illusions of like our past cultural beliefs and it's just all, and we need to get, when we get real, we have to stare into the abyss of meaninglessness and so on and so forth. But in fact, people mostly would say their lives are meaningful and that they are purposeful. And a simple example would just be a love relationship. Or say having a child. So when I first had my child, for instance, and and you love your child and you care about them. If someone was to come to me and say, yeah, but let's forget about your love for the child and just take a step back and look at this rationally and critically. Does your child's life really matter? Is living for your child and trying to help your child grow, is that really a legitimate purpose? Like in the big scheme of things, isn't that just all become nothing? The answer would have to sort of be no. And to even think you could ask that question is to just completely misunderstand what my child means to me. That there's a sense in which purpose itself can't be held accountable to what I call like the tribunal of reason. And to hold up these absolute commitments we have to this tribunal of reason is just a complete it's just to mischaracterize, it's to misunderstand, to not appreciate what those commitments are. And Žižek calls these commitments fragile absolutes. And the way he describes it is something like, yes, everything's meaningless, there is no big other there is no purpose, and yet you pick out something in the world that becomes absolute for you, that you would do anything for, and that is it. And it's it for you in a way that is going to be indifferent to any reasoning, to anything any reality can bring at you, but anything that anything cultural can bring at you. It's just completely indifferent to those things. It's an example of the drive. And in those things, when we commit ourselves absolutely to those absolutes, we are completely indifferent to a big other. So in the case of a parent's love for a child, or a love that you may have for a lover, it's almost like you don't care about what the world thinks. You don't care about anything that the world throws at you. That to you is the point. I'm reading Wuthering Heights at the moment with my Year 12 literature class, and that's a perfect example of exactly this sort of love. Like the love that Heathcliff has for Catherine is so indifferent to anything that's happening around them. It's indifferent to like class structures, indifferent to religion, and it's so absolute for them. You know, you've got those, these wonderful, disturbing scenes where like Heathcliff is digging up, Kathy's dead body after 18 years and going, she's still there, she's still, amazing, because he loves her and just her, and that's his absolute. Nothing metaphysical, nothing transcendent. So that is actually the end point, and that's what I'm going to be exploring tonight through this word that Žižek uses, which is called the divine. Yes, but the ultimate point being, the picture I'm going to paint for you, I use the word divine subject. That's my own coining, so you're not going to find the word divine subject in Žižek's work. But it's a way I try to capture his account of what it would be to live in a way that's faithful to his dialectical materialism. Okay. What would this divine subject be like? This is my basic outline. I'm going to do what I normally do, try to sort of explain it, and then as we go through, I'm going to give examples, repeat myself a lot, and then hopefully slowly we understand what I'm talking about. So obviously, Žižek's philosophy allows for a figure who can imminently transcend their symbolic order. So recall that in the psychoanalytical, in Lacanian psychoanalysis, when you get to the end of the psychoanalytical session, you go to this idea of traversing the fantasy. When you traverse the fantasy, you begin to realize that there is no big other. There's nothing that guarantees the coordinates for how you see yourself and what you desire. So at the end of that is not someone then who though can get rid of desire, which is impossible. But what you can do is act in what he says is an as-if mode. It's where you still relate as if there's a big other, but you actually are not taking it on. Is that the right word? You're not taking it seriously. You know that there is no ultimate big other, but you still act as if the big other exists. There's this minimum sense of withdrawal from this from the figure of the big other. So the subject, and that's also what he calls the fouled absolute. The fouled absolute is basically any sort of manifestation of this incompleteness of reality, of there being a lack in reality, of there not being a big other there. The lack of there being any final answer to who you are or what you should do. And as I'm trying to make clear, that figure is not a figure of cynical detachment. It's not a figure that says, oh, it's all useless. It's rather a figure that says, there's nothing that determines who or what I should desire, but that gap opens up the capacity for me, and this is important. It's not so much that these are divine absolutes that you choose. Sorry, the fragile absolutes are not things that you choose. They're things that choose you. So the whole point of the fragile absolutes, and again, the simple example would be, when you experience falling in love, It's not that you go around and you think, oh, I'm going to fall in love now. Who should I fall in love with? Let me do at my table and work out advantages and disadvantages of all the different people and just pick one. It's that it's something that happens. It's like an event, and you have to react to the event and respond to the event. So these attachments are absolute in the sense that they actually do become absolute for you. And the language we're going to be using is that and the language that Žižek uses something like, when you find those fragile absolutes, it's as if you're interpolated by the drive. What picks you out and demands that you follow it is this exception in the material world which almost says, now what you're going to do is be attached to me, and you follow through on that. So there's a real sense in, and what we have to come back to again and again is this idea that freedom is a following through on your necessity. It's not doing what you want, it's doing what you can't but do otherwise. And when you have those experiences of love or those experiences of ethical necessity where you have to do this because it's the right thing to do, or where you have an experience of a political revolution where it's like, we can't take this anymore, we have to fight this, we have to fight it to the end. All those things, none of those things are things that you're choosing to do in the sense of, oh, what could I do today? I could do A, or I could do, I'll do A. It's more a sense of, no, we have to do this now. This is a necessity. And it's when we rise to those occasions of following through on necessity that we actually are achieving autonomy. We're actually achieving freedom. Because we are acting as if, in those moments, we're acting as if there is no big other. So the two mottos that we're taking into account as we go through this final chapter in our journey, there is no big other which guarantees our fate. All we have is the self-grounded abyss of our love. I quoted this at the end of the talk last week, but it's such a perfect phrase. We have a self-grounded abyss. It's self-grounded because in that figure of love, you're not. It's like the love has chosen you. It's why that when we talk about love for Žižek, we use the metaphor we fall in love. We don't choose it. It's something that happens to us. It's like an accident that picks us. It's also why when we talk about love, we talk about fate, because it feels fated, but it's not fated in the sense of there's a big other there that guaranteed it would happen. It was fated in the sense that once it happens, it feels so absolute and necessary for us that it's as if it was always going to happen. Retroactively, our choice and our decision to follow through on our love rewrites the past so it was always going to happen. So it's a retroactively constituted necessity. That's how it's a self-grounded abyss. Another way to think of it is that when we... one way of thinking of how we talk about in dialectical materialism, how the subject can never meet the object are. The subject can never actually directly encounter the object cause of its desire. One way of unpacking that is to say, as human beings, we desire things. And part of what that means is we can never catch up with the effects of our desire, which means that we are going to create things when we appear in the world, but we're not going to experience them as things that we've created. We're going to experience them as things that are calling to us, that are necessary to us. And that's one way of thinking of this idea of a fragile absolute. Yes, it's only there because you're putting it there. When I experience, say, my love for my child, it's absolute for me. I can't live outside that horizon. That's just a key part of the way I'm plugged into the world. But it's not that if I disappeared, that whole thing disappears as well. That whole necessity disappears. But I also can't think I'm in control of it. I can't think that I'm a rational enlightenment subject who's looking at the world as it is and deciding that this is what I should do as a rational person. It's rather that this thing has this commitment chooses me, and I have to follow through on it, living in fidelity to it in a way. And in that sense, I can't catch up with the effects of my desire in reality. Desire happens. It creates these absolutes, and I can't experience those absolutes as things that I've created. I experience them as things that have that actually create me instead. I'm just going to. It's difficult to grasp, and so I'm just going to keep going and keep repeating it, and then eventually, with more examples, hopefully, it'll start to become clear. And this is what we have to remember as the model of dialectical materialism. And this is such a really clear way of thinking. If you have dialectical materialism, then that's basically your answer of ethics, love, politics. It's this. Act in such a way that your activity does not rely on any figure of the big other as its ontological guarantee. Okay. So what we're doing in this session, I'm going to look at this idea of Christianity. look at then how that feeds into this idea of a Žižekian divine, and then look at then I'm going to look at how that gives us something like a limiting condition on his politics. So we can differentiate between political projects that we could call legitimately plugged into the divine and ones that are not. And then I'm just going to sum up by saying, what would this figure who is living in fidelity to there not being a big other look like? Who's plugged into some fragile absolute look like? Žižek's Christianity. Žižek is an atheist. That's important to start with. So he does not believe in God. He does believe that Christianity is really important. Those two things sound contradictory, and I want to explain to you why he insists on this. And his latest, not his latest book, I think the one before that is still about how if you want to be an atheist, you need to be a Christian. And his basic point is this: for him, Christ's death on the cross means that is the literal death of God. It's like God comes down and says, "Hi." I shouldn't say it in terms of that make it seem unimportant, but it's like I'm God, and God is killed, and God can't save himself. And the realization that comes from that is, we don't have anyone out there to help us. Like God can't save us. There is no beyond who can intervene for us and tell us what to do. We've got to do it. If we want to see justice in the world, if we want to see good prevail over evil, there's only us. And so God, the death on the cross reveals the absence of there being a God. And that opens up the space for a Holy Spirit. And the Holy Spirit is the community of believers who are now acting as if in the absence of the big other, who have to take on this responsibility for themselves. So that's why he says that Christ died on the cross precisely to reject such attempts at finding a higher purpose or meaning. Rather, the message is, your standards matter to me. I throw myself into creation and abandon my place up here. The conclusions are radical. The ultimate meaning of Christianity for me is a very precise one. It is not, we should trust God, the big guy's with me, so nothing really bad can happen. That is too easy. The message is not, we trust God. The message is rather, God trusts us. The gesture of Christ says, I leave it over to you. God made the wager on us. It is really a crazy wager where God is saying, I leave it to you, Holy Ghost, community of believers, you have to do it. So in Žižek's Christianity, there's no resurrection. The resurrection is a metaphor for God in a way being manifesting, rather than being something out there as a big other, manifesting in the activities of the group of believers who know now it's completely up to them. And that's how they manifest. And so anyway, they become God. So then the question is, okay, so just why do you need Christianity? Why not just be an atheist? And there's a couple of answers to this that Žižek makes. One is that he sort of thinks your run-of-the-mill atheism is still really parasitic on theism. He doesn't think you get rid of God. So he thinks the ideal of the cross is really important, as in without the cross, you don't actually get rid of the idea of God. I want to talk about The End of the Affair. It's one of my favorite novels of all time. And in that, you have there's a woman who she's married to a politician. Her name's Sarah, and there's Bendrix is the like main protagonist. They're having an affair. It's during the Blitz, and one day they've just finished making love, and he goes downstairs to check on something, and the place where they're staying, a bomb goes off or nearby. She goes down and she finds his body, and he's dead. So she goes back and she prays to God and says, God, if you bring him back to life, I'm going to stop the affair. Like, I'm sorry for what I've done, but if you're real and you bring him back to life, I'll give it up. And then the next thing she turns around and he's back. And of course, he's an atheist. He's like, what are you doing? Why aren't you down there helping me? I got knocked over by this bomb. I'm just lying there. I wake up and instead of you helping me, you're here praying. What's going on? And she's like, you don't understand, you were dead. But he doesn't know what she's talking about. And she doesn't want to believe in God. So her problem is she has made this promise to God. She doesn't want to have to follow through on the promise. So she tries to say, how can I work out how not to believe in God? So she sees this atheist in the park and she goes and makes friends with him. And he's got this a hideous birthmark on his face. It's a birth defect. It's really just a birthmark, actually. But anyway, so he's a committed atheist. So he's always down the park committing atheism. And she makes friends with him, and she just talks to him all the time and says, "I just want you to convince me. Like, give me all the reasons why it's ridiculous to believe in God, so I can stop believing in him and going back and having an affair with Bendrix." And he's so passionate. There's one moment where she meets with him after a while, and she goes, "I'm not convinced by you, because if God was not real, why do you hate him so much? Why are you so against God?" And there's a real, there's a couple of twists and turns. Basically, she does eventually get back in Bendrix, but as soon as she does, she falls ill with a terminal illness and dies. Before she dies, though, she actually kisses the atheist on the face, on his birthmark before, as the last time she sees him. And then at the funeral, Bendrix meets the atheist, and what's happened? His birthmark's gone. So now he's traumatized by a miracle, and he doesn't know what's happened. And but it's fantastic. Like, the last things in this is just some great lines in the book where and it's just Bendrix talking to God and just saying, I want nothing to do with you, leave me alone forever. Just this rejection of God. But you get the sense that he can't, again, he's attached to God in his hatred of God. What Žižek says is that it's actually important. It's not enough, and this is something I still don't quite understand, but it is important for Žižek. It's not enough to say that God doesn't exist, because you can say, if you just say God doesn't exist and you're just this, and God can still exist for you in other ways that you just disavow. Whereas what Christianity does is something different. Christianity says that no, God is weak and God is impotent. God doesn't measure up to God. So God doesn't even believe in himself. And it's really important for Žižek that there's that moment on the cross when Christ says to God, like, "Why have you forsaken me?" Because in that moment, that's when God stops believing in God, and God says, "Oh, you're not real. I'm not real." And it's a part he quotes. I'm going to quote Jim Chesterton in a little while. He really likes Chesterton's book called On Orthodoxy. And part of the reason is that Chesterton is like him. He's a paradoxical philosopher, as in he just likes asserting paradoxes and sort of saying that's the truth. As we'll see. So that is the lesson of Christianity. It is not only that we do not believe in God, but that God himself does not believe in himself. So that he also cannot survive the non-substantial symbolic order, the virtual big other who continues to believe in our place for us. Moreover, only a belief which survives such a disappearance of the big other is belief at its most radical. And so his point is that there has to be this experience of going through, realizing that God, that God is basically this figure who can't be God, who fails at being God, which you get through the Christian myth. But his other key thing of Christianity is this idea of the Holy Spirit's really important to him. And I was so happy when I found this quote, because it really helped clarify things for me. He says, "Many of my atheist friends say to me, yes, so this is atheism. There's no God up there. We create God in our image and so on." They're like, "Well, you're not saying anything new. Why appeal to Christianity?" And he says, "But it's not that. I don't think we can translate theology into secular humanism. Not because of any secret, obscure reason, but because there must be a moment of thinking that it's not we who are acting, but a higher force that is acting through us. This element must be maintained." In other words, Žižek, what you lose when you do liberal humanism is you end up with that cynical view of reality where nothing is important, because if we take that distant rationalist view of things, ultimately everything is meaningless. But his point is that no, there is this dimension that's real where something acts through us. Whether that you want to call it a revolutionary spirit or whether you want to call it love, there's a real sense in which there's a higher power acting through us, and that's an important part of what he wants to maintain. It's an important part of why he needs to stick to Christianity and this idea of the Holy Spirit and where the Holy Spirit comes from. But you can see how that example shows how at the end of realizing there's no big other, you don't get cynical detachment. You get absolute commitment to a material reality. Yes. Okay. And this is another simple summary of the meaning of Christianity for him. So therein lies the message of Christianity, the positivity of being, the order of the cosmos regulated by laws, which is the domain of finitude and mortality. From the standpoint of the cosmos, of the totality of positive being, we are merely particular beings determined by a specific place in the global order. The law is ultimately another name for the order of the cosmic justice, which allocated to each of us his or her proper place, and so on. Which all of that, of course, is just another way of saying there is a big other, right? It's not all there is. There isn't just the natural world. There isn't just that. There isn't just that being that determines where everything is. There is another dimension, the dimension of true life in love, accessible to all of us through divine grace, so that we can all participate in it. Christian revelation is thus an example, although probably the example, of how we human beings are not constrained by the positivity of being, of how from time to time in a contingent and unpredictable way, a truth event can occur that opens up to us the possibility of participating in another life by remaining faithful to the truth event. And again, a simple way of unpacking that is just to think of the experience of love. When you, but do you see there's that direct connection between his ontology and his point about what we should do in the world? Like his ontology is, there's no ultimate big other. So any idea that says, any appeal to a natural order that says this is it and this is all there is just has to be wrong because of the subject. And then that gap makes possible these experiences of an event where you can be called out by something to live beyond what you are, and in a way live into the impossibility that you are in these commitments to fragile absolutes. A simple example would just be following through on falling in love would be a really concrete example of that. But sorry, the fascinating thing is, do you see how theological that sounds though? When he says, we are not constrained by the positive being from time to time, when he says this, there's a dimension of a true life in love accessible to all of us through divine grace that we can participate in. The other key thing here is that, he's talking about grace because, and I've said this before, it's just really important to understand that for him, it has to be this experience of it's chosen you. This is something you have to follow through on. That experience that we have in love or in ethical necessity, or when we're expressing our freedom or following through on your necessity. All of that has this idea of that's another word of saying grace. That is something that's happened that you haven't earned. It's not something that you've brought about. It's something that has, in a way, has been given to you in a sense as a gift. That element is really important. I think, and a useful way of understanding why Žižek is interested in Christianity is to look at how he contrasts it with Buddhism, at least a Western version of Buddhism. So whereas Buddhism, and the basic difference for Žižek is this, whereas Buddhism gives you an ideal of that desire is deceitful, and so you should subtract, and so when you realize desire is deceitful, and also the idea that you're separated from other people is deceitful, like you're actually all part of the same substance. And if you can, and the thing of Buddhism is like you retreat from desire, you try to get rid of the deceit of desire and enter into this peaceful state where there's no more agitation. Christianity is the exact opposite. Christianity is you attach yourself absolutely in love to the contingent material features of your world, and you will suffer for it. But that's what is there, and that's it. So rather than retreating from desire, Christianity, rather than trying to retreat from desire and from the world, Christianity throws itself out into the world and says the world, the material world, is what is there, and that's the absolute. And desire is not deceitful. Desire is what allows desire is what allows the divine to come about. In terms of those absolute, attachments. So just some quotes. This is from Chesterton about these two ideals. So no two ideals could be more opposite than a Christian saint in a Gothic cathedral and a Buddhist saint in a Chinese temple. The opposition exists at every point, but perhaps the shortest statement of it is that the Buddhist saint always has his eyes shut, while the Christian saint has them always very wide open. The Buddhist saint has a sleek and harmonious body, but his eyes are heavy and sealed with sleep. The medieval saint's body is wasted to its crazy bones, but his eyes are frightfully alive. There cannot be any real community of spirit between forces that produce symbols so different as that. The Buddhist is looking with a peculiar intentness inwards. The Christian is staring with a frantic intentness outwards. If we follow that clue steadily, we shall find some interesting things. This is the meaning of that almost insane happiness in the eyes of the medieval saint in the picture. This is the meaning of the sealed eyes of the superb Buddhist image. The Christian saint is happy because he has been cut off from the world. He is separate from things and he is staring at them in astonishment. But why should the Buddhist saint be astonished at things? Since there is really only one thing, and that being impersonal can hardly be astonished at all. All those vague, this it gets to a point that Žižek repeats again from the Gospels, which is where Jesus makes the point that you can't follow me and at the same time love your family. Like you've got to make a choice between those two. Chesterton again. All those vague theosophical minds for whom the universe is an immense melting pot are exactly the minds which shrink instinctively from that earthquake saying of our Gospels, which declare that the Son of God came not with peace but with a sundering sword. The saying rings entirely true, even considered as what it obviously is, the statement that any man preaches real love is bound. The statement that any man who preaches real love, is bound to beget hate. It is as true of democratic fraternity as a divine love. Sham love ends in compromise and common philosophy, but real love has always ended in bloodshed. And this comes back to the point of where, in Žižek's politics, where he talks about having to choose sides. That for him there isn't the position of being able to take yourself out of the conflict of the situation or the contradiction of the situation and say, oh, but let's just look at both sides evenly and give everyone a fair go is false for Žižek. Once you're committed to that absolute love of seeing every single, like in this case it would be the Holy Spirit, so of seeing every single person as counting for one, and that becomes an absolute for you, that will oppose you, almost like violently oppose you to the other, to everyone who's against that in the world. So the message of Christianity is not one of peace for Žižek. It's one of it's violence, but it's not necessarily a physical violence. It's more of a violence in terms of an absolute rejection and of typically of the status quo. Because nearly always the status quo is going to involve some sense of trying to legitimize an unjust hierarchy by appealing to some form of natural order, right? But in simple terms, remember like when Žižek talks about love, he says that the structure of love is evil. It's not evil in the sense that it's bad and it's naughty. It's evil in the sense of it's a manifestation of the subject and the drive, which decoupling from nature. It's an expression of the incompleteness of nature. And if you define evil as that, then that's how love is evil. And that's how it's like this, because it's not grounded in anything but itself. It's a self-grounded abyssal love. So it's going to defy any symbolic judgment about whether it's legitimate or not, right? That's the sense in which love is actually always grounded in evil. Yes. So, and this is back to Žižek now. So it's here that the gap separating Hegel from the Buddhist experience is unbridgeable. For Hegel, as a Christian philosopher, the problem is not how to overcome the split, since the split stands for subjectivity, for the gap of negativity, and this gap of negativity is not a problem, but a solution. It is already in itself divine. The split, of course, being that we split from each other, like the split of being that there's an incompleteness in our reality, that we're always going to be frustrated by by desire and by the unfinished projects of our loves and of our commitments and so on. But that split itself, or what I just talked about, like the evil of love, that's already divine for Hegel. Like that's the solution. That's the whole point. So the divine is not the abyssal, all-encompassing substance unity behind the multitude of appearances. The divine is the negative power tearing apart the organic unity. Christ's death is not overcome, but elevated into spirit's negativity. Imagine someone experiencing oneself abandoned by God, left to one's own devices with no big other secretly watching over one and guaranteeing a happy outcome. Is this not another name for the abyss of freedom? This abandonment in a state of freedom causes anxiety, not because the divine is far from us, but because it is too close, since it is in our freedom that we are divine. So the point here would be getting to the point where it's like everything's in such despair. And he often talks about these sorts of figures, like figures who, through some experience, become completely subtracted from symbolic reality. It'd be like a type of experience where something happens and all of a sudden you realize everything I've done in my life, all the rules of society, all that is just all nothing. It's just all rubbish. I don't believe in it anymore. I'm beyond it now. He says, in that state, when you suddenly realize you're completely alone and you suddenly realize that there is no big other and there is no guarantee, at that point, you become for Žižek Christ on the cross. At that point, that's when you directly identify with God. God identifying with his own impotence. And at that point, that's when you're actually free. Yes, that's when you actually encounter the divine. The divine is not, now I see this beautiful transcendent God who's communicating with me. The divine is that now I see there's nothing there. It's only me. There's nothing else I can rely on. And the fact that I have to, be responsible for that, the fact that I have to choose, the fact of that freedom, that's where the divine exists. Yeah. It's quite a dark vision. But you can see how it's almost like the darkness and the darkness and the despair and the love and the infinite life are the same. They're like two sides of the same coin. They're really close to each other. Okay, so now let's talk about the Žižekian divine. So when Žižek talks about the divine, then, as we've just seen, it really means to encounter and to tarry. I sort of use that word tarry with the negative. Sorry, obviously using the word a phrase that Žižek uses all the time. So the divine and tarrying with the negative just means, in a way, keeping open that space of subjectivity. So not trying to define, not trying to shut it down. It means, and you sort of affirm this lack of the other with the radical contingency of reality. And it also it means affirming the non-coincidence of the subject and the object are, which I'm going to talk more about. But that's just that idea that you're appreciating that those things that are absolute for you, you're not choosing them. They're things that you have to experience as necessities. That's another way of saying you can't catch up with your object are. The object are is something that is an effect of your subjectivity and reality, but you can't see it as an effect. You can't control it as an effect. It's something that it will appear as something that's other than you, that's gone, that's always beyond you. And it involves being interpolated by the death drive. So you're being caught up with an absolute attachment, but your attachment becomes completely it becomes completely self-subsistent. It's not reliant or guaranteed, or it doesn't care about any other sort of legitimacy. That's beyond it. And even though that sounds, like the language makes it sound fairly extreme, but if you, when you look at stories about like people falling in love, that idea that two people fall in love and they like make their own world, that idea of you have a couple and like that couple's world becomes an absolute for them, and they become indifferent to what everyone else thinks. That's just another way. I mean, that is basically that idea of a love grounded in this, like self-grounded in an abyss. It justifies itself and it's indifferent to everything else, and it follows and it's insistent on its own course that's indifferent to everyone else, in the same way that the drive is insistent and doesn't care about following any rules. It doesn't care about its ontic origins and staying true to nature, and it also doesn't care about any symbolic rules. And of course, you can have love that's not like that at all. I mean, a love, a coupling that's based on, if we're together, we can improve our social media profile, or if we're together, we can, our parents will be happy, and by being together, we're making sure that we're, continuing our family bloodline. That's really important. All those sorts of things that appeal to a big other would not be that sort of a love. So because they're, and that's the difference, right? They're not based on, they haven't grounded themselves in the drive. And it's break time. So we'll break for 10 minutes. Yeah, start again at 7:25.
All right, I'm excited for it. Yeah, I just had a long day, and it's exactly what I needed. Yeah.
I can agree. I'm gonna need to like reaffirm it in reading, but
Oh, I mean,
by reading, cement it. But I think
I got 2 copies here, in fact. Yeah.
yeah, is that good?
Yeah, it's actually.
Yeah, have you read it? I didn't. Yeah. Yeah.
Like the first thing I read it, so because I'm very interested in looking at that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is essentially sort of Elon Musk's like
Yeah, I've heard him give interviews about it, and I was kind of put off. Well, not put off, but I'm like,
Yeah.
I'm not writing a paper with a professor about
clarity.
Yeah.
brain damage. Is the context. So she has a very similar definition. So I'm writing about writing a phenomenology on the experience of that, but then also like social spaces, how that changes and how like social spaces can be constructed. So anyway, she recommended that I read that.
Yeah.
And then Nick Lance things.
I've not got that yet. But we're looking at how it's great.
Drive
Capital.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
I haven't read it. Yes, but yeah. So she still talks about so like yeah. She talks about plasticity. Yeah. So she says that's the actual that
Yeah,
is
no, it's interesting.
is that
like that's
right? Is that kind of all existing is
dealing with similar problems.
that film accepted positive ideas that like growing and becoming a person, but it's never accepted all those like negative aspects like trauma. It shows that we should be viewing
Yeah, more of it.
so anyway,
That's one of the concerns.
through how
Hagel's definitely an
I just definitely don't know how. Just like I mean, you took insights, but it's that kind of thing.
the point was I was trying to say
To do that. My okay. Marks and Plato. I think they're probably. I mean, sorry, that's not totally true. I think that's like too different. Like he throws out too much marks and stuff, and too much like you initial accounting insights in favor of nobody. We're at
What is that big?
Really?
So I sent you that. I'm actually
I feel like one much.
Yeah, limited important kind of right. I was surprised that they seem like do this thing, I think it's slightly different emphasis. It's kind of interesting. This is actually my first one.
You know what their policies?
I like reading those
Well, what I.
Oh, okay.
I don't think Žižek. I like it.
Well, what do they want you to do?
It's
Go
not
around
nice.
there and say, no.
It's not nice. It's
So what they do is,
drive to reach our spaces, but
and then like trip.
there is no.
So.
And I just thought about it's like
One of my
a
lectures.
Things.
pleasure.
Yeah.
So I just finished.
You get it from Linda.
Right. Yeah, we'll, so we're looking at running.
You know?
I'll probably do like I'll probably try it. So I'll probably do it like quick straight through. Prep for that.
Yeah, so my recommendation would be to our summary of like.
Sorry. Just
join
like
the
with-
He's
with-
like a short time.
Well, maybe I did.
So I
Yeah.
take that and go, no, it's
Like, I know that they're great guys.
Yeah.
The door knob, I don't,
I get to read.
And without that,
When I read the chart, I don't go, oh, the cards alternatives.
It's almost like it's
It's like the time, right, what actually happened.
having
There's no
conversations
industry
across the
and
country,
trying to waste.
labour is failing to act on the side and go.
That's kind of like
But
what
it's doing-
the death.
No,
You know what I mean? Because
No.
when I don't think
I saw the
when I did
was about,
when I
that's
read
what
up
I was
towards the death trap, I did.
I might be wrong.
I get what you're talking about. There is that difference,
They're
the
like,
emphasis on repetition. It's kind of it's unusual, I think. But I don't know. I don't feel confident enough to try and challenge the second any of those reasons.
Because the way it was.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
do you feel like you're
Remember, even down to 77.
it's really funny, actually.
Hey, Chris, what do you think about the Jacques Miller and Žižek beef?
Oh, I don't even know what it is.
So Jacques Miller just denounces, well, as any like stores like animals for taking the kind of clinic. This main thing against Žižek is that it's this market brand Lacan that kind of did, yeah, which I think is actually a fair point to argue. But he says, oh, well, it's getting, his position now is, oh, well, it's getting more people into Lacan, so good for Žižek. It's really funny to hear him get really angry about it, but.
No, yeah, Žižek comments on this in a book by
Just raise awareness. Anyway, I'm
Children
gonna
Desire
go
of Psychoanalysis. He writes a
find out what they.
Martha or something. But
I
it's,
wasn't happy.
but he comments on this, yeah, exactly that, like this thing where, yeah, like these real fights within like Lacanians around who's a real Lacanian.
Yeah.
How you-
To be fair though, I do agree, like Žižek does seem to have St. James, like when you read Garrett or all the time with Freud, like but how they take the death drive, and I think how Lacan takes the death drive is really different from how Žižek takes it. Like Žižek takes it from like this form of ultimate repetition in itself, right?
Yeah.
Like so the way like the time reads Freud, for example, is you have this Freud uses the example of you playing marbles and shooting the marbles and destroying them. Is that you have this entire industry of production for the sake of like the success of enjoyment. There's like jouissance, the undoing of pleasure. And so Žižek doesn't, for Žižek it's not about the undoing of enjoyment at all. It's about that there is that the perversion itself is the ultimate end in the repetition of perversion, which is
Yeah, in 22.
not how like when you read like the 7 on 16 so far. I mean, I've been up to the last 4 or whatever pages, so I just have terrible timetable for it. But like so far when he talks about jouissance, it's like this really excessive thing that the subject then tries to purge from themselves. As a result, they don't reach homeostasis. They could just go back to lack, and then it becomes a thing, and they lack.
You're trying to get rid of it, and you're still engaged.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's not a repetition in itself. It's like this whole process of constantly purging and rebuilding. They're not in like doing this thing for the sake of itself.
Yeah.
And you're transversing different.
Yeah. So we'll like what I'm about to get to is like the difference that Žižek draws between of JR of desire and of JR drive.
Yeah.
And I think that's how he catches out what he
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
And James was saying, like, obviously, like, Žižek's really well read up on the college, and it's not like he's admitting this in any way. Like, he very well knows it. Like, he's not just misinterpreting. But you certainly.
No, well, I mean, some people might argue he is. I think there's definitely room to like interpret the card in different ways. But I think that he's.
There's only one truth.
But he, and also remember that his project is to use Lacan to read Hegel. That's what he's doing. So his main force is actually Hegel. I mean, the reason he talks about Christianity is Hegel.
Well, that's where we started from, because, like, well, how do we feel about Hegel being flipped into such a, like, because you've read Hegel in a Wide Brain, right?
Yeah.
The book on singularity.
Yeah.
And I don't know when you need to go back, but I'd say like the reading I reckon if Hegel was around today, he wouldn't look at singularity and go, no, it's only through the fact that there's this failure for shared subjectivity to occur that true subjectivity continues to emerge once again. I don't think that's how Hegel would read it. I think Hegel would go, no, that is actually a legitimate step towards absolute spirit, and as part of it, being able to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think you just got a very different reading of what Hegel's done compared to Žižek.
Yeah.
Žižek
Well,
would say, no, that's definitely not what the absolute is.
yeah,
So,
I think it's
absolute
good back to me seeing absolute spirit as being transcendent.
Yes, it
yeah,
is.
as idealist.
Yeah, exactly. And which is probably more of a, that's probably more of a, what does it say? Like a common reading of Hegel. So Žižek's reading of Hegel is heterodox. It's,
Well, it's
yeah.
through Lacan too, right? That's the point of it. Like they use each other, they read.
Yeah, that's a fair point. But if you picked up like a textbook on Hegel, you're not going to find Žižek's interpretation, and they're not going to say, "Oh, yeah, just read Žižek and you'll understand Hegel." Like that's just people don't say that. They'll say read Žižek to understand Lacan.
To be fair, people wouldn't say read Žižek to understand Žižek either.
No, they don't. Though I got into Žižek because people said, "Oh, you should read Žižek if you want to understand Lacan." But his main thing is Hegel. Okay, I'll keep going. Okay, so gone through that. So before I unpack this idea of the divine, I just want to make this really interesting distinction that Žižek makes in Less Than Nothing between the obj-r of desire and obj-r of the drive, and because this is just an important part of understanding the point I've been trying to make that this divine subject for Žižek is not someone who chooses their project, it's something where the project chooses them, or the fragile absolute chooses them. So obj-r is the object cause of desire. It's the object in the thing that you desire. It's the thing that makes you desire something, basically. So in the case of the obj-r as the object cause of desire, you have an object which is originally lost, which coincides with its own loss, which emerges as lost. While in the case of the obj-r as the object of drive, the object is directly the loss itself. So in the shift from desire to drive, we pass from the lost object to loss itself as an object. That is the weird movement called drive. Sorry, that is to say, the weird movement called drive is not driven by the impossible quest for the lost object. It is a drive to directly enact the loss, the gap, cut, distance itself. So the difference is, whereas when you have an obj-r of desire, it's like you're after you, and let's say, what's the example I always use? I'll just try to use a really basic example. So let's say I've got, I really desire ice cream. So the obj-r of the ice cream is like, oh, the reason I desire the ice cream, there's something in this ice cream that makes it amazing, and I'm after that ice cream. And of course, for Lacan, when you get your actual object of desire, the actual physical ice cream, I get the thing I want, but I don't get the object cause. So I always miss the object cause of desire. No matter how much ice cream I get, I never get the reason I want the ice cream in the first place. So that's the object of loss. It's like this primordial perfect ice cream has been lost. I'm trying to, and I've got all these other ice creams that are substituting that, but no matter how many ice creams I get, I never get to the final absolute ice cream. Whereas when the obj-r moves to the drive in that example, it's now the whole point is to miss the absolute ice cream. The drive becomes, its point becomes missing the ice cream is the point of wanting the ice cream in a way. So another way to think about it, whereas if you have the obj-r, the desire is just trying to get to the obj-r, whereas drive just wants to circle it, and all it wants to do is circle it. It doesn't want to get the obj-r. And in a way, the obj-r of the drive is just that missing of the object. It's the circling of the object. Yes. So the concept of the drive, and this is why the concept of the drive, there's a common reading of Lacan that Lacan's idea of desire means it desires something tragic. We never actually get what we desire. We're always destined to be frustrated. And Žižek says, well, the concept of the drive makes that alternative either get burned by the thing or maintain a safe distance false. For drive, the thing itself is a circulation around the void, or rather the whole. The drive is such as the death drive, that's a death drive, not in the sense of longing for universal negation or the dissolution of all particularity, but on the contrary, in the sense of the spontaneous life flow of generation and corruption becoming stuck on some accidental particularity
and circulating endlessly around it. And of course, that is another thing of like becoming stuck on like those fragile absolutes. The point in that relationship of drive, when you're relating to the absolute, it's not that you're trying to close. I don't know how to put this right. It's not like you're trying to close your to like grab the absolute and somehow subsume it or to grasp it. It's that you want in the object R of the drive, the very frustration, the very incompleteness of the of your relation to the absolute is the point. That becomes what you're. So in the drive, you want to keep. The whole point is to keep that distance, that desire there, not to close it. So in the example of love, for instance, whereas desire, when it comes to love, would be something like, oh, I desire you. So often with desire and love, it's caught up with like false idealizations. It's like, oh, I desire you because you're amazing, and and so there's a thing in you that's more than you that I desire. But if I get too close to you, then that dissolves. Like if you have a crush on someone, and do you remember that the example I always use? It was like the Lipton commercial. It's from years ago, and it was and a lady's like in the shopping center, and she sees this really attractive black man, and she goes up to him, and she's like picks up this coffee, and she goes, oh, she's like trying to flirt with him. She goes, oh, look at this coffee brand I'm getting. It's really exotic, like where you're from, Kenya, like where you're from. And he goes, really, Warpshire, how wonderful. It's like this. So it's like the moment he talks, the thing that made him an object of desire suddenly collapses because she just had him framed as an exotic other, and he's from Warpshire. And so that's an example of the ObJR suddenly collapsing. It's like, no, there's a gap there that you can't, that what you were after was a fantasy that's not real. But in a genuine love relationship, the point isn't that in a way you want to have the other. It's, as Lacan describes in the genuine love relationship, what you're giving to each other is the thing that you don't have. There's a sense in which you're attached to them, and it's not because of any quality they have. It's not because of any predicates that you can attach them. It's just because of their separation, because they just exist, and because of the point of their existence. And so the point in the genuine love relationship is it's almost like the ObJR of the drive. The point is not to close the gap. The point is to keep the gap forever open, and for that never to close. So in a way, the point of the drive is that frustration of never being able to be done with a love relationship, or never being able to be done with a political project, or never being able to be done with an ethical project, is part of the point of those projects, or those absolutes. The frustration is what they are, and is part of the life that's involved in them. It's not something that the way you're missing. So, so now I'm going to go through. So when I was like doing my study, it's like you read these things where he starts talking about the divine, the absolute, and I just want to share some of them with you because they seem so disparate, and we're just going to look at them through some lenses, and then hopefully by looking at them through this idea of the drive and fragile absolutes, we'll be able to decipher what they mean. So one is, of course, love and the absolute. This is a pretty straightforward one, but it's worth reading because it's such a great description, again, of this idea of what Žižek means by living, as what I would call divine subject, by living in faithfulness to these divine absolutes. What is it to find oneself passionately in love? Is it not a kind of permanent state of exception? All the proper balances of our daily life are disturbed. Everything we do is coloured by the underlying thought of that. The situation is properly beyond good and evil. We feel a weird indifference towards our moral obligations with regard to our parents, children, friends, even if we continue to meet them. We do so in a mechanical way, in a mode of as if, and there's an as if coming up again, as if the big other existed. Everything pales into insignificance compared to our passionate attachment. In this sense, falling in love is like the blinding light that hit Saul Paul on the road to Damascus, a kind of religious suspension of the ethical, to use Kierkegaard's terms. An absolute intervenes and derails the normal run of our affairs. It is not so much that the standard hierarchy of values is inverted, but more radically that another dimension enters the scene, a different level of being. So there's no big other in Žižek, right? But now we're going to read these sorts of phrases. This another dimension coming into reality. Or now you're going to glimpse the other reality outside of reality. And it's like, I thought, Žižek, the whole point is that there is none. You've been going on about how there's no other reality outside. Like, what's going on here? So we have to decipher what he's talking about, and it's going to get weirder before it makes sense. But you can see how, like, that whole thing of falling in love, this idea of like going beyond good and evil, and do you see how that's what allowed? So when like relate to that as if mode, that idea of falling in love, you're in a way decoupling from your symbolic and ontic reality in that moment, and it becomes an absolute for you. Like all of a sudden, that's it. I don't want anything else. So in Žižek's philosophy, that is the point of life. Like that's the truth of life in a way. Those sorts of commitments. So that's love and the absolute. So the point is this: that's not deceitful. So the experience of being in love, whereas I know, like I guess one really like strict scientific materialist way of looking at love is that you think you're in love, but really it's just chemicals and dopamine, and it's just it's really just your body telling you you're in love, but really you're just a machine, or you have genes, and your genes obviously want to reproduce themselves, and that's all that love is. For Žižek, it's like, no, that is the point. That's the absolute, and that's like how you get to something like eternal life, right? Then here's another description of the divine. So we've got love. When people ask me whether I'm an atheist and what I think the Christian rituals of drinking the blood and eating the flesh of Christ mean, I tell them to read Stephen King and they will get it. In films like The Terminator and others like it, and in many horror movies, there is sometimes a scene where the hero is possessed. There is a bad guy who is not really bad, but is possessed by an alien. Then the good guys think they've destroyed the possessing alien, but some slimy residue of the alien is left lying around. Then comes a standard shot where the camera slowly approaches the residue, and what we thought was just a bit of squashed alien starts to move and organize itself. We leave the film with the alien organizing itself. This is the divine element. What is he talking about? And do you see how that's divine, so is falling in love, but this weird alien thing that you can't get rid of, also divine. Also divine. So the way I read that is like the idea is that that he's just associating with like that divine with the drive, like the divine with the thing that you can't get rid of no matter what you do. So the one way I'd unpack that, remember we were talking about the example last week of that the nurse who was arrested in like Stalinist Russia and tortured and just wouldn't give up. It's like, why isn't she giving up? It's like there's some sort of slime possessing her. It's like that divine element. It's like this thing that's just insisting on itself for its own sake and that you can't eradicate. And here's another thing where he talks about this drive. This is a really fascinating quote from, I think, I'm not sure where this one's from, sorry. But when we get to traversing the fantasy, and remember that's when you go through that idea of subjective destitution, where in a way you have that experience of everything that my culture says I am, everything that big other says I am, that's not what I am. There is no big other who can guarantee that. The pure being of the drive that emerges after the subject undergoes subjective destitution is not a kind of subjectless loop of repetitive movement of the drive, but on the contrary, the subject at its purest, one is almost tempted to say, the subject as such, saying yes to the drive, precisely to that which can never be subjectivized, freely assuming the inevitable, the drive's radical closure, is the highest gesture of subjectivity. It is thus only after assuming the fundamental indifference towards the other's desire, after getting rid of the hysterical game of subjectivizations, after suspending the intersubjective game of mutual misrecognition, that the pure subject emerges. And so here you get the idea that to get that subject at its purest, the one that can actually affirm, in a way, its subjectivity, again, you can only get that once you have this complete indifference to the other, and you get rid of the idea of the hysterical game of subjectivization. It's just that game of saying, who am I? Of game of saying, who am I for you? What should I want to do? What should I do? And appealing to some other to answer those questions for you. Here's another description of the absolute here. It's from his book, Sex and the Foul Absolute. The absolute is something that appears to us in fleeting experiences, say through a gentle smile of a woman, or even through a warm, caring smile of a person who otherwise may seem ugly and rude. In such miraculous but extremely fragile moments, another dimension transpires through our reality. As such, the absolute is easily corroded. It all too easily slips through our fingers and must be treated as carefully as a butterfly. Yes, that's what he wrote. It's like, what? So what does he mean by this idea of a dimension shining through this other dimension? So I'm going to we're going to have a look at a clip that involves the butterfly, and I'm going to sort of treat the butterfly as, I'm going to try and do a Žižekian reading of the clip. Okay. So this is a clip from the movie Patch Adams. In the clip, his girlfriend has just been killed by one of his psychotic patients. His girlfriend's name was Karen, and it's a very tragic moment because he convinced her to trust people. She'd found it very hard to trust people. She'd been a victim of abuse. He convinced her to trust people. And when this psychotic patient calls her up and says, "I need help," one night, she trusts him and lets him come to her, and he kills her. So it's horrible. So he's very angry at God at this moment. And Karen said she always wanted to be a butterfly. That's why I thought of this clip when I read that in the Žižek book. Okay, here I go. I'm now going to play the clip. It's called, Patch Adams Challenging God. I've got to find the mouse. Oh, there it is. Okay, so 3 different interpretations of the butterfly. I think these 2 interpretations are probably the ones directed by the people who wrote the film. Okay, so in both these interpretations, the butterfly is a message from the big other in some way. So the first message of the butterfly would be a message from Karen. So it's like Karen from beyond the world saying, "It's okay, I'm a butterfly now and I'm happy." So it's like her, or it's like her sending a butterfly to comfort him, say, "It's okay, I'm okay." Then you can have the butterfly as like a message from God, and it's a little bit like God's reply to Job at the end of Job. I was going to mention because Žižek calls Job like the first anti-ideological text, because you have this situation where this guy's suffering, just horrible things are happening to him, and all his friends are going, look, you've done something wrong. God doesn't punish people for no reason. And then finally he confronts God, and Chesterton has this great reading that Žižek agrees with, where God's whole talk to Job is like, you think I know what I'm doing? Have a look at nature. Like, just have a look at some of the things I made. That's crazy. That's crazy. I have no idea. Like, so there's, so that would be a little bit like this message. It's like God sort of going, look, you're overestimating me, but nevertheless, there's like, look at these, like there's, creation has this beauty about it, this ephemeral beauty about it, which justifies itself, which you have to appreciate. And that's what the butterfly means. It's like, how can you question me? Like, life is a miracle. You don't earn life. You receive life through grace. And so you just have to appreciate the beauty while it's there, and you can't question it too much. Okay, this would be my Žižekian reading of the butterfly, which I would like to argue is still touching, but you can be the judge of that. This would be the butterfly, because you know how he sort of ends by saying, you know what, you're not worth it. I do think that's like the genuine Christian moment for Žižek. It would be like confronting God, and God revealing, in that moment, God reveals himself as like, you know what, you're doing a terrible job. You're impotent. You don't work. And then instead of the butterfly being, oh no, actually, God, you're okay, the butterfly is him realizing that he doesn't need to rely on a big other to give purpose to the things that he picks out as being important. So here the butterfly is a type of anti-message. The butterfly, rather than as affirming the existence of a big other, is affirming an absolute contingency, which is not grounded in anything and in anything else, which would make it radically miraculous in a way, sort of what Žižek was talking about earlier. So here the butterfly's message would be something like, there is no big other, but that doesn't mean that you don't attach yourself to things in the world. It means that there's nothing, it means that you can, that means rather you can attach yourself to these physical things. There isn't anything beyond, in a way, the here and now. And so the fact that you can have that you don't need that big other to have a purpose, means that the butterfly, in a way, affirms a capacity to value and to appreciate the radical, ephemeral nature of, I guess, the things that are important to us in our lives, and that what we are is to live beyond the parameters of what is. That in this case, he's a doctor, and very, very much helping people is what gives him his purpose in life. The butterfly is something like, you having that purpose is not you following through some script that's been written to you by destiny or the big other. That's you living out the radical contingencies, bringing about something radically new in the world. It's living beyond what is, by affirming, by really affirming the fact that you are something that cannot be defined by anything. So that would be my Patch Adams thing. Now, have I explained the absolute as so when he's talking about the absolute as appearing as like there's another level of reality that's coming through. So for me, the only way you can interpret that to be consistent with the rest of Žižek, it's not that there's another alternative reality beyond appearance. It's, again, that because you have the objr of the drive, those things that pick us out absolutely, even though they're an effect of our desire, we see them as things that are absolute and in a way that choose us. So it is as if when we have those, and again, we can just think about like everyday experiences, when we have those things that we have a sense that I can't do anything else than this, or this person that I love is absolute for me, or this pet I love is absolute for me, or this political cause is absolute for me. In all those things, it's as if you have a sense that the world that is here, that is structured and that is determined by our symbolic coordinates and so on, that isn't all there is. There is something other than that, that's beyond that can't be constrained by those things. And a metaphor would be, it's as if there's another dimension coming through. But it's not that there's a reality beyond this reality, which is the true reality, which is definitely not what Žižek is suggesting. The true reality is rather the incompleteness of any reality. And that's what these fragile absolutes reveal. That our actual, the reality that we're told is the way it is because it's nature, or because it's the economy, or because it's common sense. That's not all that the world is. That there's always this alternative dimension, and that's this dimension that comes through when we have these fragile absolutes come into our lives, or truth events, or whatever you want to call them. And so another way, a word he talks about the absolute is appearance as appearance. And I think that's another useful way of unpacking this idea of an absolute, not as something beyond or behind appearing, which would be like a Platonic idea of there being the truth, like the truth behind like the mundane surface reality. Rather, it's the revelation of the lack of that substantial truth behind appearance, that all there is appearance. So when he talks the absolute as appearance of appearing, it's not that there's another transcendent reality that's manifesting in our own reality in some way. Rather, what's manifesting is the inexistence of a big other. So an imminent failure of reality to close itself. There's an insistence on the gap between subject and substance. So when you see appearance as appearance, rather than seeing it as there's appearance and then there's the real thing behind it, it's like, no, there's appearance and that is what's there. Back to where we started, the idea of that the very ignorance, its failure to fully grasp the reality, indicates a limitation, failure, or lack in the substantial content. So again, whereas the Kantian idea would be, well, there's appearance, but then there's the phenomenal, but then behind it there's a noumenal, there's the reality of the appearance. For Hegel, when you see appearance as appearance, you see the very lack of you being able to see all of appearance, or the very lack of there being the substantial reality somehow behind appearance, as that the positive opening of the subject in reality. Okay. So then that will be my definition of the divine. It's the absolute is the manifestation of the radical contingency of existence, that there is no big other and no order outside of appearance that grounds it. It involves this becoming interpolated by the drive. So a contingent part of your world becomes chosen, which becomes absolute. And again, it's the experience of being chosen. And again, those examples I'm using, things like falling in love, things like being caught up in an ethical cause, and so on. And in this acting in faithfulness to the divine, you traverse the fantasy. So because you become figures of this drive, which becomes committed to these fragile absolutes just for their own reasons. And again, in that self-grand abyss of love, it's not going to be reliant on, it's not appealing to, it's not justified by anything outside of itself. It's indifferent to any sort of evaluation or limitations in the symbolic or ontic orders. So now I want to quickly touch on how this gives you a normative dimension to Žižek's politics. I've got to finish in 7 minutes. Okay, I'll do this. So one problem with this is isn't this too individualistic? So how can it help us inform our politics? I'm not going to be able to go through all of this, but I just want to remind us of what the difference between right and left is for Žižek. So whereas right-wing political commitments still involve believing in a substantial big other, in a sublime object of ideology, some fantasy of perfection, such as, America for Americans, Australia for Australians, make America great again, relying on some real idea of real Americans existing somewhere. On the left, on the other hand, at least going to Žižek, it involves you're actually traversing the fantasy. There is no so whatever the social order says you are, that's not truth. That's not true. That's always just a contingent thing. And the one thing that we all share in a genuinely emancipatory politics is that we all accept that the identities, that we're not the identities that we're given by our society, that we're always something other than those identities. And of course, it will involve identifying with and supporting the part of no part of that social order. And this is just, I just want to have this quote about universality. So universality inscribes itself in particular identity as its inability to fully become itself. So I'm a universal subject insofar as I cannot realize myself in my particular identity. And this is why the modern universal subject is by definition out of joint, lacking its proper place in the social edifice. And so universality does not inscribe itself in your particular identity, but rather in the out of jointness of that identity, the way in which that identity can't complete itself because it involves a subjectivity that can't be, which can't be subsumed in that identity. So that's how you have a concrete universality for Žižek. Which is why you have universalist politics is going to identify if the subject is void. And in any particular social situation, the truth of that social situation is going to be looking at that social situation from the perspective of those who are told that and do not belong to that situation, who aren't given status as subjects in that situation, because they're the ones who actually occupy the position of what the subject actually is. So when you combine those two things together with his idea of the divine, you don't get an ethics in regards to Žižek saying this is what you should be committed to, because his philosophy is pointing to these are things of absolute truth events. These are things that occur in the world. He's describing them. His philosophy isn't bringing them about. But it does place limiting conditions on what could be taken as genuine emancipatory political movements. So what his theory does allow you to say is that if you have a politics that is based on that idea of universality and the divine, it means that you can't help but wish for the emancipation of everyone, because part of what you'll be affirming is that everyone is like the perpetual non-existence, the perpetual challenging of any sort of social order. So any politics that appeals to a really existing big other, even if they claim to be emancipatory, isn't really emancipatory. It's a false emancipation. So if you have someone appealing to, which is why, Žižek would say, I made that point a few lectures ago, that's why January the 6th wasn't a genuinely emancipatory movement, because it was all based on the reality of there being a really existing America. That's what they were fighting for. They weren't fighting for the universal subject or the freeing from appeals to the non-existent big others. And you can also see how that insurrection wasn't universal. It wasn't an insurrection that was about attempting to include everyone and attempting to allow everyone to count for one. It was an insurrection based on the idea of, no, we want some idea of radical exclusion so that we can have real America for Americans and get rid of false people and people who aren't really American and put things back to the way they should be. So in both those senses, it falls short of the Žižekian litmus test of being a genuinely emancipatory thing. Which is my answer to why I think, even though Žižek's philosophy doesn't give you any absolute answers as to what one should do, it does give you a simple litmus test to be able to work out whether to evaluate whether a political movement is actually emancipatory and universal, or whether it's trying to maintain the status quo in some way. And that's what Žižek's analysis of Nazi Germany is exactly that. It was a revolution, but it was a revolution to try to keep things the same. It wasn't to try to change things. And the same thing's happening in America at the moment. That right-wing revolutionary fervour is all about trying to keep things the same. It's trying to bring back to what's always been by an appeal to big other. It's not about a genuine emancipation or universality at all. Okay. So I'm not going to be able to talk about, I'm just going to go through the features of the divine subject and I'll finish here because we've run out of time. So if you're going to talk about what do we get at the end of Žižek's philosophy? The divine subject has these features. So it involves a type of subjectivity that holds open itself being a subject, that it being this in a pure point of potentiality, a pure point of potential change. It's beyond the physical because it can't catch up with the way in which it's described in reality. It's a subject of the death drive in that its projects and its commitments are sort of absolute. They exist for their own sake and they can't be stopped. It's a subject that involves grace or fate in the sense that when it has those fragile absolutes, it experiences them as being chosen for it, as destiny, as a necessity it has to follow through on. And it involves an absolute attachment not to a beyond, but to the contingent and the material features of the world. So it's very much about the here and now, not about the beyond. But nevertheless, when Žižek unpacks that, it's that, but because that's so absolute and because it's a manifestation of the object of the drive, it seems as if it is almost like another reality shining through, as if you are seeing, you're encountering something other than what is. But of course, what you're really encountering is just the effect of your subjectivity, because that's exactly what subjectivity is, something that is something other than what is. I'm going to have to skip over this part, but closing thoughts. Conclusion. So, a couple of things I just want to finish on. One is that I hope we've seen how ontology matters. So, one of the interesting things about I found studying Žižek is that where he starts really determines where he ends, and you can't really take out that ontology. It underpins how he frames reality, underpins all the other aspects of his philosophy, up into the way he answers the question of how we should live. Žižek to me is really important because he's really moved beyond the impasse of postmodern and post-structuralist approaches, which really frame freedom and transgression as emancipation. Sorry, that really frame transgression from the norm as emancipation. Whereas Žižek is able to, for his idea of emancipation does involve something like discipline and commitment to absolutes. So I think that's a real different way of framing what emancipation is. A simple way of talking about his ultimate insight would be something like when you have that dialectical materialism and you have the non-existence of the big other, ultimately the conclusion of that is love, a commitment to fragile absolutes. So what you don't get is despair and nihilism, but actually just what we call love or ethics or genuine political fervour in the favour of universality. And in living to commitment to these absolutes, we reveal the perpetual incompleteness of what is. We reveal the reality of subject incompleting substance. And we find ourselves found in a desire that pulls us out of ourselves into an infinite engagement that persists for its own sake beyond any ontic or symbolic coordinates or justifications. And that's another way of saying we find something like eternal life. The end. Thank you, everybody. That's the end of the course. And I'll turn off the video and then we'll answer any questions.